The ceremony had been running for 11 minutes when the mother of the groom stood up. The venue was full. The flowers were perfect. The music had been exactly what the couple had chosen together over 3 months of careful planning. The bride was standing at the altar in a dress that had taken 4 fittings and 6 weeks to complete, a dress that her mother had helped her choose, that her best friend had cried when she first saw her wearing it, that the bride herself had looked at in the mirror the morning of her wedding and felt, for the first time in her adult life, entirely herself. And then the groom's mother rose from the front row and said, in a voice designed to carry, that the wedding could not proceed. She said the dress the bride was wearing was not hers to wear. She said it had been stolen. She said it in front of 214 people, and the words landed the way words land in a full room when they are delivered with absolute confidence by a woman who has spent decades understanding how to make a room listen to her. What happened next destroyed a family, exposed a secret that had been buried for 19 years, and changed every life in that building before the evening was over. But the dress was only the beginning. Stay with me. Because what was really happening in that room was something nobody in it was prepared for. Welcome to Bishop Tales, where every week we bring you powerful, emotional, and unforgettable stories that stay with you long after the video ends. If you are new here, please subscribe right now and turn on your notifications so you never miss a story like this one. Drop a comment and tell us where you are watching from tonight. Are you in Nigeria, Ghana, the United Kingdom, the United States, Canada, South Africa, Jamaica, or somewhere else in this world? We love knowing where our family is. Now let us begin. Her name was Adana Nwosu, and she had been planning her wedding for 8 months with the specific intensity of a woman who has waited a long time for something she wants and intends to do it right. She was 31 years old, a secondary school biology teacher in Enugu who was known among her students for the particular combination of high standards and genuine warmth that produces teachers whose students remember them specifically across decades. She was not flashy. She was not someone who required an audience. She was honest in the direct and uncomplicated way of people who were raised to believe that honesty was not a choice but a baseline. She loved Emeka ease with the steady and unperformative quality that she brought to everything she did, not loudly, not dramatically, but completely, the way things are loved when the love is real rather than constructed. Emeka Ease was 34 years old and worked in corporate accounting in Enugu. He was a methodical and thoughtful man, careful with his words in the way of people who understand that words said in one moment can occupy a very large space in the moments that follow. He had met Adana 3 years earlier at a mutual friend's birthday gathering, had spoken to her for 2 hours about things that had nothing to do with romance, and had driven home thinking about the conversation for reasons he had not yet identified but which became clear to him over the following weeks. He had called her. She had answered. The rest had unfolded with the particular ease of things that are right, not effortlessly but naturally, the way relationships feel when both people are actually suited to each other rather than performing suitability. They had been engaged for 14 months. The engagement had been uncomplicated by most measures and complicated by one measure, which was Emeka's mother. Her name was Chidinma Ease, and she was a woman of considerable presence. She was 63 years old and had spent most of those years in the deliberate construction of a social position that she wore with the practiced ease of someone who has earned their standing and intends to keep it. She was a retired civil servant who had spent 27 years in the state government's education ministry, rising through the department with a consistency that her colleagues attributed to competence and her adversaries attributed to tenacity, and they were both correct. She had raised Emeka and his younger sister Chioma alone after their father died when the children were young, had done so without making the children feel the full weight of that difficulty, which was the thing that Emeka valued most about her and which he acknowledged to Adana in the early months of their relationship as evidence of his mother's character. What he had described to Adana less completely was the other dimension of his mother's character, the one that expressed itself in opinions delivered with the finality of conclusions rather than the tentativeness of suggestions, the one that assessed people with the rapid and total judgment of someone who had made many assessments across many years and had constructed from that experience a sense of her own accuracy that made revision feel like unnecessary work. Chidinma had looked at Adana early in the relationship and produced an assessment that was not positive, and the assessment had not changed across 14 months of engagement regardless of what evidence Adana produced through her actual behavior. Chidinma felt that Adana was not the right woman for her son. She had not stated this in terms that were confrontational, which would have been addressable. She had stated it in ways that were subtle, which were not. A comment about the family Adana came from. A question about Adana's ambitions that carried the implication that teaching was not quite sufficient. A remark at a family dinner about the qualities that made marriages last that was technically general but landed specifically. Adana had received each of these with the composure of a woman who was not going to permit another woman's discomfort with her to become a crisis in her own life. She had discussed them with Emeka, who had spoken to his mother, and who had reported back that his mother had said she was simply being honest and that honest concern was not the same as opposition. Adana had said that was one way of understanding it and had moved on, because moving on was what she did when the alternative was a battle she had not started and did not want to have. The dress had been the first point where something felt different. Adana had found her wedding dress in the third shop they visited, she and her mother and her best friend Obiageli, in the way that people occasionally find things they have been looking for, not gradually through elimination but immediately through recognition. She had put it on and looked in the mirror, and the three of them had been quiet in the specific way of people who are all thinking the same thing and do not need to say it. The dress was a deep ivory, structured at the bodice and flowing from the waist, with an embroidered overlay that caught light in a way that was subtle and extraordinary simultaneously. It was the right dress. It had always been going to be the right dress. They ordered it and paid the deposit and came back for the fittings, and Adana wore it on the morning of her wedding and looked in the mirror in the bridal suite of the venue and felt the particular alignment of appearance and interior truth that is available to a person on very few days of their life and was available to her on this one. She did not know that Chidinma had been to the dress shop. She did not know this because it had not seemed like a thing to know, because what reason would a woman have to visit a bridal shop after her son's fiancé had already selected a dress, because the information would have required someone to tell her, and the someone who might have told her had decided that it was not relevant information. The seamstress at the shop knew Chidinma from other occasions, from fittings for church events and society functions, and when Chidinma had come in asking about the dress her son's fiancé had ordered, the seamstress had been professionally accommodating without being professionally discerning about the implications of the questions she was answering. Chidinma had looked at the dress. She had looked at it very carefully. And something had shifted in her face that the seamstress noticed but could not quite name, something that was not simply the reaction of a future mother-in-law examining her son's bride's choice but something older and more complicated than that. The ceremony began at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. The venue was a function hall that had been dressed with the specific care of 8 months of planning, white flowers and warm lighting and the details that accumulate when two people who have thought about a thing for a long time are given the resources to execute what they have thought about. The guests were 214 people who represented the combined social geography of two families and the friendships of 30 years of lives lived in the same city. The music was live, a small ensemble that played during the processional with the restrained elegance that the couple had specifically requested. Adana walked down the aisle on her father's arm. Her father was a man of 60 who cried without apology and who held his daughter's hand with the specific tightness of a man who has been waiting his whole life to walk someone he loves towards something good and is now doing it. She reached the altar. Emeka took her hands. The officiating minister began. 11 minutes in, during the reading of the couple's personal vows which they had written together and which were honest and specific and a little funny in the way that the vows of people who actually know each other are funny, Chidinma stood up. She did not clear her throat. She did not ask permission. She stood and she spoke in the full voice of a woman who has decided that silence is no longer the position she is prepared to hold. She said the wedding could not proceed. She said the dress the bride was wearing had been stolen. She said she could prove it, and she said it with the certainty of someone who believes they have the proof and are prepared to produce it. The room became the specific silence of 214 people processing the same information simultaneously. Emeka's expression moved through several things in rapid succession. The officiating minister took a step back. Adana stood at the altar and looked at her soon-to-be mother-in-law with an expression that was not panic and was not anger but was the expression of a person who has just been told something that makes no sense and is waiting for the sense to arrive. Chidinma said the dress was made from fabric that had been taken from her late sister's unfinished wedding gown. She said her sister had died 19 years ago before her wedding could take place. She said the fabric, a particular embroidered overlay that was distinctive and not widely available, had been kept by the family after the sister's death and had gone missing 8 years ago when the family home was being cleared after their mother's death. She said she had recognized the overlay the moment she saw it in the shop. She said she had photographs of her sister wearing the fabric during a fitting. She produced her phone. She showed them to the minister. She showed them to Emeka. She said this was not a coincidence. She said she was not going to allow her dead sister's wedding fabric to be worn at a ceremony without this being addressed. Adana said she had purchased the dress from a registered bridal shop. She said she had a receipt. She said she had paid for every element of it. She said she had never in her life taken anything that was not hers, and she was not going to stand at her own altar and receive this accusation without saying so clearly. Her voice was steady. The hands holding her bouquet were steady. Only the person standing closest to her, which was Emeka, could see that her eyes were doing the thing eyes do when something is being held back that has every right to come forward. Emeka said to his mother, quietly and with the specific quality of a man who has been here before in smaller versions of this argument, that this was not the place for this. Chidinma said the place was wherever the truth needed to be told. She said she was not attacking anyone. She said she was protecting her sister's memory. She said if the fabric truly had an innocent explanation, then the explanation should be easy to produce and the wedding could proceed, but she was not prepared to remain silent while something that belonged to her family was used without acknowledgement. The minister suggested they pause. The guests, 214 of them, sat in the particular suspension of people who have arrived for one event and are now inside a different one. Adana's mother, a woman named Mama Adiz who had the quality of reserve that comes from a lifetime of difficult things endured quietly, stood up from the family pew and walked to the altar. She stood beside her daughter. She said, very quietly, I think we need to talk. She said it to no one in particular. She said it in the tone of a woman who knows something relevant and has just decided that the time for the knowing to remain private has ended. Now friends, I have to stop here for just a moment. Because if you are watching this and your heart is beating faster, you are exactly where Bishop Tales wants you to be. Please like this video right now and leave a comment. Tell us, what do you think Adana's mother knows? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. We read every single one. And if you have not subscribed yet, please do it right now, because what comes next in this story will rewrite everything you think you have understood about what is happening. They went to the small anteroom behind the stage, Adana and her mother and Emeka and Chidinma, and the minister who served as the only neutral party present, and they closed the door on 214 people who sat in the hall and spoke to each other in low voices and waited with the collective patience of people who understand that the thing happening behind the closed door is larger than the thing they came to witness. In the anteroom, Mama Adiz sat down. She sat with the deliberateness of a woman who has been standing for a long time and has decided that what comes next requires her to be still. She looked at Chidinma. She said, your sister's name was Uchenna. Chidinma's expression changed. She said yes. How do you know that? Mama Adiz said she knew because she had met Uchenna 19 years ago. She said she had met her through circumstances that she had never spoken about to anyone, not even her husband, not even Adana. She said she had been carrying these circumstances for 19 years and she had believed she would carry them to her grave, and she had been wrong. Chidinma said, what circumstances? Mama Adiz said that 19 years ago she had worked at a hospital in the city as an administrative officer in the records department. She said a young woman had come to the hospital. She said the young woman was pregnant and alone and frightened in the specific way of people who are facing something without the resources or the support that the thing requires. She said the young woman had given her name as Uchenna Ease. She said she had been maybe 24 years old. She said she had been wearing a cloth that Mama Adiz had admired, a beautiful embroidered fabric that the young woman had said was part of the dress she was going to be married in, that she had come to the hospital for a final check before the wedding, which was 2 weeks away. She said Uchenna had been warm and funny and had talked about her fiancé with the specific joy of a person who has been surprised by how good something turned out to be. She said Uchenna had come back to the hospital 2 days later. She said it had not been a planned visit. She said Uchenna had come back in a state that was very different from the first visit, frightened and pale and asking for help that the hospital was not structured to provide. She said Uchenna had told her, in the corridor outside the records room, that she had discovered something about her fiancé that had changed everything. That what she had discovered was not something she could recover from or pretend to have not discovered. That she was going to have to leave, and that leaving with a pregnancy and no support and nowhere to go was a specific kind of terrifying that she could not fully communicate. Mama Adiz said she had helped her. She said she had used her own money and her own connections to help Uchenna find temporary housing and access to a social support organization that worked with women in situations like hers. She said she had stayed in contact with Uchenna for several months. She said she had eventually lost contact, as these things sometimes went, when the organization moved and the phone number changed and the city shuffled people in the way that cities do. Chidinma was very still. She said, "What happened to the baby?" Mama Adiz looked at her daughter. Adana was looking at her mother with the expression of a person who is realizing that the conversation she is sitting in is about her in a way she had not known before entering the room. Mama Adiz said the baby had been a girl. She said she did not know what had happened to the baby after she lost contact with Uchenna. She said she had thought about it many times across 19 years. She said there was something she had kept. She said when Uchenna had come to her in the corridor she had been carrying the fabric from her wedding dress because she had just come from a fitting. She said when Uchenna had left the city she had left many things behind, including the fabric, which she had pressed into Mama Adiz's hands and said she would not be needing it anymore. Adana said, "Mama." Just that. Her mother's name and a look. Mama Adiz said she had kept the fabric because she had not known what else to do with it and because it had seemed important to keep it, and that 8 years later when she was making her daughter's coming-of-age dress she had used some of it, and years after that when Adana had found a wedding dress she loved and the seamstress had asked whether she had any additional fabric she wanted incorporated, she had given the seamstress what remained of it because she had thought it was time the fabric became what it was always supposed to be. Part of a wedding. She had not known whose wedding fabric it had originally been. She had known only that it had been given to her by a young woman who had needed help and who had pressed it into her hands with the wordless weight of someone leaving something of themselves behind. Chidinma sat in the anteroom and the composed certainty that had characterized her entrance into the ceremony hall was no longer present in her face. What was present instead was something much older and much rawer and much more honest. She said her sister Uchenna had left the city 19 years ago. She said she had known that Uchenna had been pregnant. She said she had not known the details of why Uchenna had left. She said Uchenna had died 7 years later in another city, a complication that was medical and that came without sufficient warning, and that among the things that had died with her was whatever she had known about what had happened in the months before she left. Chidinma said she had spent years wondering and had eventually accepted that some things could not be recovered. She said she had not known about a baby. She said she had not known that her sister had had a child. The room was very quiet. Adana said, slowly and with the specific precision of a person assembling information in real time, that her mother had been in contact with a pregnant woman named Uchenna 19 years ago. That Uchenna had left a child. That Mama Adiz had kept the fabric. She looked at her mother. She said, "Am I that child?" Mama Adiz's face did what faces do when a question that has been circling for a long time finally arrives as words. She said she did not know. She said she had lost contact with Uchenna before the baby was born. She said she had found Adana through the social support organization years later, a child without permanent placement, and that she had fostered her and then adopted her and that she had always intended to tell her when the time was right and the time had never seemed right and then the time had been so long past that she had not known how to begin. She said she did not know with certainty whether Adana was Uchenna's daughter. She said she had believed it was possible. She said she had told herself she was protecting Adana from a history that was painful and uncertain. She said standing in this room now she understood that she had been protecting herself from a conversation that was difficult and that her daughter had deserved to have years ago. Adana was quiet for a long time. The kind of quiet that is not the absence of words but the presence of too many of them arriving at the same time for any of them to get through. She looked at Emeka. He was looking at her with the expression of a man who has just discovered that the history of the woman he loves is more complicated than he knew and who is deciding what that means. He reached for her hand. She let him take it. Chidinma looked at Adana. The composed and certain woman who had stood in the ceremony hall and stopped a wedding with a claim about stolen fabric was sitting in this anteroom looking at a young woman who might be the daughter of the sister she had lost, who might be her niece, who might be blood in the way that blood matters to people for whom family is the most central category of the world. She said she needed to understand. She said she had not come to the wedding intending this. She said she had come intending to stop something she believed was a wrong and she had stopped it and in the stopping she had stepped into a room she had not known was waiting for her. She looked at Mama Adiz. She said her sister had been wearing a specific fabric at the last fitting she attended before everything changed. She described the fabric. She described the embroidered pattern. She described the color. She described the particular weight of the cloth which she had touched when she had hugged her sister goodbye on the last day she saw her alive. Mama Adiz listened to the description and said nothing until Chidinma finished. Then she said yes. That was the fabric. The minister who had been sitting quietly in the corner said he thought they needed a moment before any more was said. He said what was happening in this room was significant and it deserved to be handled with the care that significant things deserved. He said the 214 people outside would wait. He said they had been waiting and they would continue to wait because what happened next in this room was more important than the schedule of the ceremony outside it. Adana said she needed some air. She stood and Emeka stood with her and they went through a second door that led to a small corridor and then to an outdoor space behind the venue, a narrow garden with a bench and the particular silence of outdoor spaces adjacent to full buildings, the sense of the gathering existing just beyond the wall. She sat on the bench. He sat beside her. She said she did not know how she felt. He said that was reasonable. She said she had always known she was adopted. She said her mother had told her when she was 7 in the careful and age-appropriate way of parents who understand that the truth told kindly is better than the truth arrived at by accident. She said she had never had strong feelings about not knowing her biological history because her life had been full and loved and she had not felt the absence as an absence. She said she had not expected it to arrive as a fact in the middle of her own wedding with her mother-in-law pointing at her dress. He said he was sorry. She said sorry for what? He said for his mother. She said his mother had come to the wedding looking for stolen fabric and had found something neither of them knew was there to be found and that was not precisely a thing to be sorry about, it was a thing to be stood in and understood. He said he loved her. She said she knew. She said the question of whose daughter she was did not change who she was. She said she had a mother sitting in an anteroom who had kept a secret for 19 years out of a combination of protection and fear and who had just given the secret up in the most public and uncomfortable way possible, which was not the ideal way for a secret to end but which was the way this particular secret had ended, and that Mama Adiz was still her mother, had been her mother for 24 of her 31 years, and a DNA question did not revise that. He said what did she want to do? She said she wanted to go back inside. She said she wanted to sit with her mother and Chidinma and the minister and talk about what needed to happen next, which included a conversation with her parents about the full history of what Mama Adiz knew and a DNA test when they were ready for it and a relationship with Chidinma that they would have to build slowly and carefully from this very unusual starting point. He said and the wedding. She looked at him. She said the wedding was today and she was not going home without being married to him if he was still interested in being married to her, which she assumed he was given that he was sitting on a garden bench holding her hand. He said he was very much still interested. She said then let us go back in and finish what we started. They went back into the anteroom. Adana sat down across from Chidinma. She said she understood why Chidinma had stood up. She said she did not hold it against her. She said that whatever the truth of the biology turned out to be, the fabric had belonged to Uchenna and Uchenna had given it to Mama Adiz and Mama Adiz had eventually given it to her, and the chain of possession was not theft but love, the kind of love that passes things forward without fully understanding what it is passing or to whom. She said she thought Uchenna might have been glad to know where the fabric had ended up. Chidinma looked at her for a long moment. Then she said yes. She said Uchenna would have been glad. She said Uchenna had been the kind of person who would have been glad. Mama Adiz said she was sorry. She said it to Adana and she meant it in the full and specific way of a person who is not apologizing for an action but for a sustained omission, for the years of not saying a thing that should have been said. She said she had convinced herself she was protecting and she was now sitting in a room where the consequences of the protection were visible and she could see clearly that protection had not been the whole truth of her reasons. Adana said she understood. She said she wished she had known earlier and she would tell her mother that clearly in the days that followed, but she said it without the performance of injury, which was accurate to who she was. The minister asked whether they were ready to return to the hall. Adana looked around the room. She looked at Emeka. She looked at her mother. She looked at Chidinma, the woman who had just gone from the person who stopped her wedding to the woman who might be her biological aunt, a transformation that had happened in the space of 40 minutes in a small anteroom, which was perhaps the most compressed version of a relationship reversal that any of them had ever witnessed. Chidinma said she had something to say before they went back out. She said she had come to this wedding with the intention of protecting what she believed was her family's property. She said she had not come with the intention of destroying her son's relationship or humiliating the woman he loved. She said she understood that was what had happened regardless of her intention and she was not going to pretend otherwise. She said she was sorry for the way she had done it. She was not sorry for having raised the question, but she was sorry for the manner of it, for the public nature of it, for the specific humiliation of being accused at your own altar. She looked at Adana directly. She said the bride she had seen standing at that altar was, whatever the DNA said, possibly the daughter of the sister she had loved most in the world. She said that if the DNA confirmed it she would be grateful beyond what words were available to her. She said even if it did not confirm it she thought the woman standing in front of her was someone Uchenna would have loved. Adana's eyes filled. She did not blink the tears back. She let them come in the way that things come when they have been held and the holding is finished. She reached across the small table and put her hand on Chidinma's hand. Chidinma looked at the hand and then at the face above it. Something in Chidinma's face opened in a way that the 214 people outside the door had never seen and would not have recognized as belonging to the woman they knew, the composed and formidable woman who had stood in a ceremony hall and stopped a wedding with a pronouncement. This was not that woman. This was a woman sitting in a small room holding the hand of someone who might be the last piece of a sister she had been missing for 12 years, and the experience of that possibility was dismantling everything she had assembled across 6 decades of keeping herself together. They returned to the hall. The 214 people had not left. Some of them had helped themselves to the drinks that were meant for the reception. Most of them had stayed in their seats. All of them turned when the doors opened. The minister walked to the front. He said he wished to explain briefly that a matter of family significance had arisen and had been addressed in private with the full agreement and participation of all parties involved. He said the ceremony would now resume. He said he was grateful for their patience and that the love story they had come to witness had not changed in its essential nature even though the context around it had deepened considerably. Adana and Emeka returned to the altar. Mama Adiz sat in her pew. Chidinma sat in the front row on the groom's side and she did not hold herself with the armored composure she had maintained for the first part of the day. She sat with the expression of a woman who has put something down and is discovering that putting it down has made her lighter rather than more vulnerable. The minister asked them to continue with their vows. They did. The words they had written together, honest and specific and a little funny, were the same words they had prepared and they said them in the same ceremony hall with the same flowers and the same music and the same 214 people. But the room was different now in the way that rooms are different when the truth has been spoken in them. Fuller. More real. The particular weight of an honest thing said in front of witnesses doing what it does to a space. When the minister said they were married, when Emeka took Adana's face in his hands and kissed her, when the room produced the sound that rooms produce at the end of a ceremony that has delivered more than anyone arrived expecting, Chidinma was the first person from the groom's side to stand. In the weeks that followed a DNA test was done. It was done quietly and with the mutual agreement of everyone involved and it was done because the question deserved an answer rather than because any answer would change the relationships that had been formed or the ones that were forming. The result confirmed what Mama Adiz had believed and had carried and had not said. Adana was Uchenna's daughter. She was Chidinma's niece. She was a member of the Ease family in a way that the Ease family had not known until a woman stood up in a ceremony hall and stopped a wedding with a claim about stolen fabric and found, underneath the fabric, something that nobody in that room had been prepared to find. Adana sat with Chidinma over several weeks of careful and unhurried conversation and learned about Uchenna. She learned the shape of her biological mother's face from photographs, the particular sound of her laugh from Chidinma's descriptions of it, the specific quality of her intelligence which Chidinma said had been the kind that was always 5 steps ahead of the conversation it was in. She learned about the fiancé who had caused Uchenna to leave, the specific betrayal that had sent her away pregnant and alone to a city where she had found a stranger in a hospital corridor who had helped her. She learned about the years Uchenna had lived elsewhere and the complication that had taken her, and she sat with the particular grief of learning a person you never knew but are part of, the grief that has no established form because it is grieving the loss of something you never possessed, which is in some ways the most disorientating kind. She told Chidinma what she knew of herself, the things she had built and the person she had become and the values that had shaped her, and she watched Chidinma listen with the particular attention of someone who is performing the specific task of understanding another person's history for the first time, and who is finding in that history the traces of someone they loved. She said once that she thought Uchenna had made a brave choice. She said leaving something that could not be recovered, going somewhere new without resources and without support, building something for a child you were carrying with no certainty about how it would go, was a particular kind of courage that she hoped she had inherited. Chidinma said she thought she had. Emeka watched all of this from the position of a man who loves a woman and is watching her discover parts of herself that were always there but had been unknown to her, and the watching was the particular honor of a husband who understands that his role in this discovery is not to direct it but to be present for it. He had spoken to his mother separately. He had said things that needed to be said about the manner of what had happened, the public nature of the accusation, the specific experience of standing at your own altar and receiving it. His mother had listened. She had said she knew. She had said the manner had been wrong. She had said she was working on understanding the gap between having a legitimate concern and deploying it in a way that caused unnecessary harm, and that working on it was perhaps something she should have begun considerably earlier in her life. He said he appreciated that. She said she appreciated that he had said so directly. The relationship between Adana and Chidinma built the way relationships build when they are started under unusual conditions and continued with genuine intention. Not quickly. Not without difficulty. There were conversations that were hard to begin and harder to finish, and moments where the weight of 19 years of not knowing each other pressed against the lightness of genuinely wanting to know each other. There were also the moments that come when two people who are trying, who are both bringing their honest selves to a thing and not performing it, find that the trying is producing something real. They had dinner together once a month. Chidinma brought photographs. Adana brought questions. They sat across the table from each other and built, in the careful and unhurried way of people who understand that what they are building cannot be rushed and should not be, a relationship that had a foundation that was unusual and that they were choosing together anyway. The fabric from the dress went to Chidinma after the wedding, pressed and preserved, the part that had been incorporated into the dress and the piece that remained. Adana gave it freely. She said it should go back to the family it came from. Chidinma said it had come back to the family it came from. She said it had just taken a complicated route. Adana said that was perhaps the most accurate description of the whole story. Because a wedding had been stopped by a dress. That was what people said in the city when they told the story, and people did tell it, because it was the kind of story that circulates in communities where 214 witnesses exist and where every one of them has someone they want to tell. But the people who told it were telling the surface. The thing underneath the surface was not about fabric and not about accusation and not even about the DNA test that had confirmed what nobody had known to look for. The thing underneath was about a young woman who had left a city 19 years ago carrying a child and carrying a piece of embroidered fabric and who had pressed the fabric into the hands of a stranger who had helped her, and about the way that things given in moments of loss sometimes find their way back to the people they were always supposed to reach, not on a straight line but on the complicated and indirect route that is the only one available when the truth is buried deep enough that it takes a wedding and a woman standing up in a small anteroom and a long conversation to bring it to the surface. And at the surface it was simply this. A daughter who had not known her mother's name. A family that had not known the daughter existed. A woman who had carried the connection between them for 19 years in the form of a piece of cloth and had passed it forward without understanding what she was passing. And a wedding that stopped and then continued, and a marriage that began with more truth in it than most marriages begin with, and 214 people who went home that evening with a story they would tell for the rest of their lives about the day a ceremony hall in Enugu became the room where something buried for 19 years finally came up into the light. If this story reached you tonight, please share it with someone who needs to hear it right now. Like this video and subscribe to Bishop Tales for powerful emotional stories every single week. Drop a comment and tell us where you are watching from, and tell us this. Is there a truth in your family that has been carried too long in silence? This story is proof that the truth finds its way eventually. Tell us in the comments. We want to hear from you. There are many more stories coming to this channel and they go deeper than this one every single time. Thank you for watching Bishop Tales. We will see you in the next story.